Well, can you believe it? We've already covered 9 chapters. We're covering 18 for the entire semester, so we're at the halfway mark. So let's look at the learning objectives for Chapter 10. The first objective asks for you to define a contract and then explain the objective theory of contracts. A contract actually is an agreement between parties that is enforceable in court. For example, a promise to accept a date for the evening and then backing out would not be enforceable in court because there was no legal intent. There has to be something else that would actually bind the parties. The objective theory of contract will help us determine whether the promises made are actually legally binding, and it's based on 3 factors. And they are, first off, what the party actually said; two, how the party acted or appeared; and finally, the circumstances surrounding the transaction. So, for example, in the above example I gave you about backing out of a date, if, however, I was in a situation where I was going to a company dinner and it would be appropriate to have someone with me as a partner, I could actually hire an escort. Now, I'm talking about something above, not. Uh, I'm a loss for words. Something legitimate is what I'm trying to say. So I'm going to hire an escort to accompany me to the dinner, and that would qualify as a contract and would be enforceable in court, because which you'll see in question number 2 as to why that would work. Okay, so the second learning objective is talks about the 4 basic elements that are necessary for that contract to be valid. And the first one is an agreement. So all that means is that there must be an offer, will you mow my lawn, and an acceptance of that legal agreement, and that would be the party says, yes, of course I will, and then of course you negotiate, how much or whatever. The second element would be consideration, and that's what you give in value to make that promise binding. So if we go back to the original one where you asked for a date, there's nothing of value given. You're not paying them to go on a date for you, so there has to be something that's going to bind that. The next one would be capacity, and that means that the parties to the agreement possess the characteristics that qualify them as being competent. For example, they're mentally competent, they're of age, and so forth. And legality means the purpose of the contract must be legal. For example, I can't hire you as a hitman and then expect the courts to enforce that when you try to back out. The next, let's see. The number 3 is the difference between an express and implied contracts. An express contract is a contract in which is entered into by words, either written or spoken. So if we go back to the example, will you mow my lawn for $20? And you say yes, there the terms are, and they're oral, but they're just as valid as if they were in writing. Implied is a contract where either the contract is formed in part or in whole by the conduct of the parties. For example, if I walk into a barber shop, don't say a word, a chair becomes available, I get up and sit in it, the guy cuts my hair, and oddly enough, not a word is spoken, that's still going to be a contract. And of course, when he's done, I will owe him for that haircut. What's the difference between, number 4, what's the difference between a void and voidable contract? A void contract is one that has no legal effect. In other words, basically no contract exists. If I hire you as a hitman, the court's not going to enforce that. A voidable contract is where one or both of the parties could back out. Generally, when we talk about minors, if I enter a contract with a minor, as an adult, the contract, I can't back out, but the minor probably would be able to. And the unenforceable contract means that the contract is valid, but for some reason it's unenforceable. It might be that you waited too long to enforce it, or something along that line. The text will get pretty specific for you on that. And then finally, what rules guide the courts in interpreting contracts? A couple things I wrote down here. The plain language laws, and this is relatively new, but in recent years, the lawmakers are making it so that contracts must be written in the language that an ordinary person like you or I would be able to understand. Legalese, even among the legal professions, is kind of being eliminated. The second item that I wrote down is the plain meaning rule, and that simply says that when a contract, the language in the contract is not clear, the courts well, I'm sorry, when the language of a contract is clear, the courts will enforce what they see. If the courts determine that a contract is ambiguous, it's because something has happened. First off, the question might be raised is the intent of the parties, if the intent of the parties it cannot be determined by the language, does it lack a provision that on a disputed item? Is a term susceptible? Is there a term is susceptible to more than one interpretation? And then is there a possibility of uncertainty about a provision? Then the courts will say what's ambiguous, and then the courts will attempt to interpret that. And finally, and probably this is one that the Objective 5 is talking about, the other rules of interpretation. But basically, there are 8 listed, and when the courts look at trying to interpret a contract in dispute, a reasonable, lawful, and effective meaning will be given to all the contract's terms. That's the first one. A contract is interpreted as a whole document. So in other words, you can't take out a specific clause and say, well, this is what it means, but the rest of the contract doesn't sound like that's what it means. Okay, the next one, terms that you negotiate are going to weigh heavier than terms that were not negotiated separately. Words are given their normal meaning unless the parties intended something differently. Specific or exact wording is given greater consideration than general language. Typewritten or written terms will prevail over pre-printed terms. So if you cross something out and then wrote over it, that generally signifies the latest intent, and that's what the courts would enforce. And then the party who drafted the contract is going to be responsible for ambiguous terms, and then the contract will be interpreted against that person. And then evidence of trade usage, prior dealings, and course performance may be admitted to clarify ambiguous terms. The example I used when I was in a face-to-face class is if I were to, for example, and I wanted to buy a hog, and so I go out to a farm, and do I get to actually pick out one, or do they, let's say I'm going to buy 50 hogs. Can I go through and say, oh, I want that one, I don't want that one, I want that one, I want that one, I don't want that one? I don't know, but I'm sure that there's trade usage or whatever that would tell that I could or could not, what I could or could not do. Okay, anyway, that's contracts. It seems odd that this course being based on contract law don't actually start talking about contracts until Chapter 10. But that's a relatively new phenomena with this author. Anyway, good luck, and I'll talk with you in Chapter 11.